before my time, I think.
I don't think it
No?
entirely was, but yeah. Anyhow, right.
Um, what that was his spiel.
Yeah, he did the sports on either CBS or NBC, and he was like in New York, and it was like you talk about a game, says let's go to the videotape.
Um, okay, so we're gonna go to the videotape now. Try
Let's
to
go to the video.
find dear friends, family, and neighbors, and fellow Facebook passersby. Welcome to today, this morning's episode of a Rabbi and a Yiddish Troubadour walk into a Zoom. I'm so thrilled to have a dear friend, Meyshke Alpert, um, here with us in our Zoom room. Um, Meyshke, where am I finding you today?
You're finding me at home in Scotland, where I live in a little village on the east coast of about maybe 60, 70 miles northeast of Edinburgh. Um,
How and how long has this been home for you?
it's officially been home for a little over 6 years. The my wife Emily Feiner has been teaching at the University of St Andrews, which is about 10 miles from here, for the last 12 years. So I was visiting a lot, or we were going back and forth between New York and this place was very different from and a very welcome change from the after the 35 years I spent in Manhattan.
Wow.
But yeah, so about 6 years ago, I emigrated and moved over here.
And you're someone who carries so many different languages and stories and communities with you. Where does where does how does your story begin? Where does your story begin?
Well, for me, my story begins in Los Angeles, California, which is where I was born. And people often, ask me what sign I was born under, or I choose to phrase the question that way so I can say I was born under the Hollywood sign, which I was literally. I was down the hill from it, and so I lived in LA for my first 12 years. The first couple of them right underneath that Hollywood sign. Ooh, how bizarre!
Hollywood's
I never get phone calls here.
Hollywood's calling. I'm gonna, as you pick up, I'm gonna try and figure out how also to share this on different.
I'm gonna switch my phone off. Sorry, I
That's
didn't.
okay.
It's my U.S. phone, and I barely even think about it. And if I get calls that aren't from friends, they tend to be telemarketing in Chinese. Having lived in New York all those years. Anyhow, um, yeah. So we were back in Los Angeles in the mid 1950s, or I was, and so I lived in L.A. my first 12 years, and with and ultimately in California. I mean, people think I'm just from LA. By the time I was 8 or 10, I really identified as a, for sure, by the age of 12, I identified as a Californian very much, and I spent a bunch of time in Northern California too. And but then in connection with my parents' divorce, I moved to Boston, the
Hmm.
Boston area, very suddenly when I was 12. So end of the summer 1966. So that's where I went to the last couple of years of junior high, and and then high school, and then spent a couple of years living up in the woods in New Hampshire and Vermont, and better part of a couple of years in Yugoslavia in my late teens. And when I was 20, I went back to LA and spent about 5 years there, and that was where the whole kind of I and friends began our chapter of the whole klezmer and Yiddish Renaissance. And then I moved to New York in 1979.
Hmm.
Um, but we've gone a long way from what your question was, which is where did I start? So I started in all of those places.
Yeah.
And now very, in a turn that I would never really have expected, but turned out to be a very wonderful For I now live in rural Scotland.
Do but and so and tell us, did you grow up with music in the home? What kind of music did, if so?
Yeah, well, literally in my home, I grew up with the music of my mother playing piano. She was actually a very fine pianist who was
Mm.
at times a professional, semi-professional pianist, and uh, and with classical music. But then, of course, a whole other uh, layer of Jewish music in, and as well as some Russian and Polish, Ukrainian music, particularly in the community. That I could kind of say more about that, but just to give a sort of overview. Um, and I don't really come from a traditional folk singing family in the sense of someone like Itzhak Gottesman or but there was music in shul, Jewish music, and I should say that I come from some kind of a to quote a friend of mine, a dark gray shade of Hasidic family, coming out of Lubavitch. But this was long before Lubavitch was where they came from. Was long before Lubavitch was a multinational corporation. Before it was
Mm.
Chabad Lubavitch Incorporated, and they were old time Lubavitcher from out of the backwoods, the forests
Mm.
in Lithuania and Belarus. And so what that meant was there were a few nigunim and stuff at home, and if I daven a little differently than other people and so forth. But so don't I I didn't come out of Crown Heights, Lubavitch, but
Right.
there were a lot of what I do come out of was a really almost anachronistic old time Russian Jewish Litvak, not in the contemporary religious sense, but Litvak in the geographical, cultural sense of being from Lithuania and Belarus. Old time Russian Jewish extended family, which was really pretty remarkable given
Mm.
that they came to the U.S. long before the Second World War. They weren't survivors. They weren't. They weren't they weren't Yiddishists, but they were, as I often say, they were just Jews. But some gehalten etwas
Yeah.
Yiddish in a really, by the time I came along, certainly a very warm, old time kind of way. That
Did they speak? Did your parents or grandparents? Did you speak Russian or Yiddish or at home, or was it English? And
all of those, all of the
yeah.
above. I mean, there's a great term that I love in linguistics, which is called heteroglossia, which means the presence of many languages or several languages at
Mm.
least. In, kind of interchangeably. So I grew up for sure speaking Yiddish, and more again in my family. When I say my family, I don't really mean the nuclear family of my parents only, because
Hmm.
that began to fall apart sort of early on in my life. But when I talk about my family, I mean my parents, my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. I never met my father's parents,
Mm.
and but I did grow up till I was about 5 or 6 with my mother's parents in Los Angeles. They were the Austro-Hungarians in the family, the Bukovina and Galicia side. Um, but because my parents were much older than the
Mm.
parents, at least 20 years older than the parents of most of my peers, and thus my aunts and uncles, for example, they were the age of, or older than many people's grandparents, my age. Like, for example, all of my aunts, my father's sisters, were born in the 1890s. My oldest
Mm.
aunt was born in 1892. So I was really raised by people from out of the late 19th century and the very beginnings of the 20th century. That
You
has a great deal to do with who I am and what I
right.
do and what I do in life. And
I was gonna say like it's those that's a recipe for an old soul.
yeah.
The and and was it a religion? You mentioned going to shul. Would you Did it feel like a religious home growing up, or was that just part of what the family did when they did it?
It wasn't even as much shul as it was a kind of home. I mean, Shabbos, Yontif. Like I often say that I was Jewishly homeschooled, and one thing I definitely did not go through, and I feel very fortunate in this sense. I didn't have the generic American American Jewish Hebrew school
Hebrew school
experience of the
experience.
1950s and 60s. When I say I was Jewishly homeschooled, I learned, at my not even as much as my parents' knee, at the knees of my aunts and uncles, and so to the point where right, some you may know, and some people out there are probably familiar with the wonderful Chazan Ben Zion Miller, who comes out of the Bobov community, and when we had gotten to know each other, the first time we really kind of sat down and had a serious discussion, the first thing he said to me was, he said, "So tell me, where do you come from? Because you know too much to be who you look like." So that kind of says it all. And I grew up, I feel very blessed in this sense to have grown up really with a foot in the frum world and a foot in the freie Welt, because I also went to Schule, particularly thanks to my mother. I went to a wonderful uh, Linky Schule in Los Angeles,
Wow.
between the ages of 6 or 7 and 12, and that's really where I also began, singing Yiddish and remember all the songs from there. And so I have
What
both of those heritages.
what type of songs they sing in Shula then?
Um, some Linky lieder. Well, I mean, I think the first song that we learned was is not so link, but it has it that sounds so leftist particularly, but it has the very much the community sense. Was Lomir alle men bagrisen, oi Lomir alle men bagrisen, oi Lomir 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 alle men bagrisen, and Lomir die Schule bagrisen. Also weiter. Um, but we also sang, Sag nicht kein Mal, du gehst im letzten Weg, Chotschim den Bleine, verstellen bläue Tag, etc. And alle Menschen seien Brüder, misch die Farben moist zusammen, schwarze, bräune, weiße, gelbe, von den Taten, von den Mamen. Peretz's wonderful translation of, or version of, the Ode to Joy from
Hmm.
Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, um, and etc.
And I'm and so as a kid, from Shula to Shul, um, I can't imagine you had many peers who would accompany you as you traverse from community to community. Or maybe you did. I was gonna. What was it dissonant as a child, or was it again part of your milieu, just part of what the family did?
It's interesting. I wouldn't use the word dissonant, which is I'm actually kind of relieved to think of that. They were different worlds, but I guess well, let me start from here. Is that I feel now that they've, and really only in more recent years, that the many worlds of my life, which are both, cultural and geographical, have, I feel like they've integrated a
Mm,
lot more within me, more
mm.
recently. But there they were, I definitely felt that difference and that distance from both my peers and the world of LA and California, Southern California. Um,
I forgot this is happening in LA.
yeah, right. Which is, and it's not the LA of today,
Yeah, yeah.
which is important to say because it's more like if you go out of LA and go, say, into the Central Valley of California, where you're not in kind of blue coastal California necessarily. When I
Yeah.
was growing up, and LA was still kind of cowboy country,
Mm.
and particularly given the work my father did. Was first he was a scrap steel buyer, and then he worked for a construction equipment company. So I grew up in scrap yards and on construction sites,
Mm.
and the presence of a lot of people, the kind of people we would call Americans, which is of course not us, um, was there were a lot of folks, especially who of the generations that came out of the Dust Bowl to California in the late 1920s and 1930s, folks from the South and the Southern Midwest.
Mm.
So, but just and there was a dissonance in a sense. I mean, I definitely felt that distance between both myself and that American world,
Mm.
and also the growing kind of great plastic sprawl of Los Angeles, which
Mm-hmm.
was coming into being there, and then, and also a distance from my Jewish contemporaries too.
Mm.
And one way I'd characterize that is that I really was never very interested in the generation of my friends' parents, the generation kind of who were, chronologically kind of would have otherwise been my parents. What the folks I was interested in were the old folks, the
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, the folks that came from Europe, whether or if they came from somewhere else, whether Jewish or not. I should also say, I mean, a big part of me was the my contact with and the presence of Mexican culture and Mexican music in my life.
Mm.
That's a major thing for me. I mean, people, especially when I'm kind of teaching or performing, and in Europe, people have often asked me, "Oh, have you spent much time in Mexico?" When I talk about this, I'm like, in a lot of ways, when I was growing up, and in some ways even more so now. I mean, Southern California and Los Angeles in particular is really, in many ways, a part of northern Mexico.
Mm.
Um, it's people talk about LA as the northernmost Latin American city, and it's the third largest Mexican city, in fact, in terms of people Mexican or people of Mexican descent. So that's a major influence to my life. So I mean, when I hear when I hear Mexican music, especially a lot of Mexican regional folk music or mariachi or something like that, that's home to me. That's
Mm.
not some exotic
Mm-hmm.
thing from somewhere else. That's home.
Mm.
So those worlds are all part of it.
Can you take us back to then the whenever it was in the 70s, whenever it was that you went back to LA and you sort of discovered or klezmer Yiddish music as a young adult?
Yeah, well, and let me preface that by saying that in the meantime, I'd moved from the land of the palm trees and the pines and the redwoods and so forth to the land of the maple trees
Mm.
and real winters with snow and frozen lakes. And that's
Mm.
that's another thing that's important to say.
Mm. Mm.
It's important for me to say is that my father's family in particular were rural Jews. They weren't from Varsha or Lodz or you know, they came from small shtetl and also small, really kind of logging hamlets in the woods in Lithuania and Belarus,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was a big difference. And both of my parents and my whole family were very much. They had a great love of nature and were kind of always going out to like the mountains, the woods, and in particularly to lakes in the woods. My New
Mm.
England family, because when again when my both of my families, actually my mother's family and my dad and his family, when they came to the States, they didn't come to New York. They None of them went to New York. They went to Boston.
Mm.
So they were very much New England Jews. And my mother went to LA very early on. But so to bring this full circle, I had been in that East Coast, northeastern U.S. world, especially the New England world. And then I went to and spent time in Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
I didn't. I wanted to go back to where my dad was from and where my mother's family was from, but those were border areas of the Soviet Union, so I couldn't really go there. And we're talking about the early 1970s now.
Hmm.
I was 16 when I first went there, and then 18, 19 when I lived there.
What
And
brought you there?
well, wanting to connect with
Hmm.
Eastern Europe and that heritage. I mean, I just was always
Hmm.
into that from as long as I can remember. I was 3 years old or something. I was always asking my dad about where he came from, and
Hmm.
like I said, I wanted to connect with that immigrant generation. So the place that ultimately turned out to be the accessible place for me to go to, and very similar in many respects place, was Yugoslavia.
Hmm.
And I also had gotten into folk dancing and gotten very into like Balkan, Yugoslav, and Bulgarian, etc. Dance, and then which quickly dance and music. And so I don't. By the time I went back to LA in 1974, so I was 20,
Hmm.
I had had that experience and a lot of exposure to lots of, even more than when I was a kid, to lots of different kinds of East European non-Jewish music,
Hmm.
but to which I always felt those as an integrated whole. To me, it wasn't Jewish music and everything else. To me, the whole kind of, not that there aren't distinctions, but the whole kind of Russian, Ukrainian, especially the Belarusian, the whole kind of East Slavic world, and and Yiddish music, and then the way that connects to the music of other parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, Greek music, etc. That was always kind of, I always saw the integrity of those rather than
Hmm.
um, their separateness, and so that's important uh, in terms of my musical development and thinking and just cultural thinking and feeling. So by the time I went back to LA, I had that experience to bring to it, and in LA, I connected with people who were very much into say the music of Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Balkan music and dance, and the I became early on a teacher at the Balkan Music and Dance Camp, which would be once a year up in the Redwoods in
Hmm.
Mendocino, and then as well as people who played American old time music, Irish music, the whole kind of Isles and
Hmm.
American continuum. But I played lots and lots of Irish music with friends out there in Irish, Cape Breton, Scottish, French Canadian, etc. And then as an outgrowth of that, um, my chapter of the whole klezmer and Yiddish phenomenon started. And maybe you want to hear about that. You
I
tell me
do.
what.
I do. I want to tease you though for a moment, if I may,
Please.
because it's the 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 disparate like communities and cultures and whose songs you sing, in your lens. I mean, now maybe it's as in the perspective you have looking in, but it's all very integrated. But I can't imagine that it's a common perspective that many Ashkenazi kids who grew up with like their aunts and uncles would feel the same type of like visceral soul connection to mariachi music the way that you do.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, to mariachi music and to Mexican music, that's, I mean, there are certainly other LA Jews who are very into that. I mean, I know a couple of LA mariachi band leaders, for example, who are
Yeah.
Jewish. I mean, et cetera. That's not so unusual, I guess. Um, but you're absolutely right. And I actually expected that you were going to say, that feeling the connection to Eastern Europe was the unusual thing, which is also, that to me is,
Well, it's all unusual
yeah,
because if you think about in this, if I'm thinking just the culture of like what's going on in 1960s or 70s in America. I mean, maybe it's not. Maybe that's that search for one's roots or reconnecting to one's roots. But I don't like. I don't know of many teenagers who then went to Eastern Europe to go live on, explore it out on their own in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said, that in some ways my going to Yugoslavia, where one of the things I did that first summer in 1970 was to um, be at a Yugoslav like youth work camp, um, which was it wasn't it wasn't set up as an international exchange thing. It was a thing that Yugoslav kids did like at the end of high school, early or first couple of years of college. Kids from about 16 to 19 or so, um, and yeah, I often say that was my it was my version of going to kibbutz
Hmm.
because see, I didn't grow up Zionist.
Hmm.
I didn't grow up with a feeling of attachment to this place in the Middle East that,
Hmm.
which it's not that I don't recognize the the significance of the state of Israel in Jewish life and particularly in the wake of the Holocaust. But yeah, I was never raised to be Zionist. That wasn't again my connection. The feeling of connection I had was to Eastern Europe and not. So that's another unusual thing, and that had everything to do with
Hmm.
kind of my life path and what I did back then and what I still do.
So was there, um, in trying to get you to well, you should feel free and comfortable to pick up your fiddle or was de Vilst whenever you do. But I'm wondering, like, was there a moment when you were in your early 20s, then back in LA, where you heard some of this Yiddish music, um, and realized and felt a sort of a magnetic connection to it, or felt like there was, or felt like there was, this is something that you wanted to delve into more?
Yeah, well, so I'll tell you the story. First, I'll make a l'chaim.
Oh, mine.
Uh, but we could do it together too, but maybe you can make a lemayim if you don't have
I'll
a
make a
libation.
lamayim.
Right, okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'dvorei.
Oh, mine. It is from Poland Spring, but no.
Yeah, it is Poland
Okay.
Spring,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. So, um, the yeah, the story is great in that my old friend Mark Simos, who's a songwriter and wonderful, a multifaceted musician and amazing musical head, who actually just became after quite a few years of teaching at the Berklee School of Music in Boston, just became a full professor. But
Hmm.
um, we only met each other when I was 20, I guess, and he was 21, and he was 18. And we grew up a few blocks from each other in West LA, but had never met until then. And ultimately, we met via Stuart Brotman's sister, who is Stuart Brotman. Some out there will recognize the name. Um, and Stu is another LA Jew as well.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so in 1976, late in the November, I think October, November 1976, Mark, who I'd begun playing Irish, old American old time, etc. music with, went back to the American Folklore Society conference in either Baltimore or Philadelphia, and he came back saying, I met a couple of guys there. First of all, I met Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett, folklorist and academic, and I met a couple of guys there, Andy Statman and Zev Feldman, who are playing this stuff that they call klezmer music, and it's the old time Yiddish music that's like the same from old '78 recordings, etc. It's the same era of traditional music, like the old time and Irish and Serbian '78s and etc. that we've been listening to. And he said, I have a tape here. It's got a few '78s on it that they gave me, and then a couple of Zev and Andy playing four tunes on the other side. And he put it on, and it was like one of the big old Jewish orchestras like the Abe Schwartz Orchestra playing klezmer dance music, and he put it on, and I went. I said, "Oh, I know that music." I said, "I remember used to hear it on the Yiddish radio, both in L.A. and Boston." Um, and then also an uncle of mine in Boston had been very involved in very early Yiddish radio, the beginnings of Yiddish radio in Boston. So he had a large '78 collection. So I said, yeah, I know that stuff. And on top of that, I recognized. I said, when he said the word klezmer, I said, I know that word too. Ich weiß what this is a klezmer. Um, First of all, somehow I'm not just through my family. I knew it meant a professional East European Jewish traditional musician, and also that and my father. I mean, I've told this story many times, but I mean, my father used to call me sein klezmer. No, klezmer meiner, spiel mir,
Hmm.
because I played music, I played violin, I played guitar, and so that's kind of how the whole thing started.
Hmm.
And very soon after that, Mark and I and Stu Brotman and others formed one of the first American klezmer, neo klezmer bands called the Chutzpah Yiddish Orchestra in late '76, early 1977, and kind of that's things started from there.
Hmm.
So it was kind of a detour, but it's hopefully a fundamental detour.
Um, I love so I love just that your father would call you that. You what instruments were you playing as a kid growing up?
Violin.
Violin.
And then when I was 12 and moved to Boston, I immediately got a guitar. Basically, chucked the violin for quite a few years, and it became a folky. Taught
Hmm.
myself guitar, sang folk songs, American folk songs, but I also always sang Yiddish and
Mm.
Russian, and I set that to my guitar playing.
Mm. Um, and and so I guess then the Brave Old World was later already. So
Yeah,
what
before Brave World came Capella, which is
Capella?
that coincided. That was what in part what moving to New York in 1979 was about. That because I had no aspirations of moving to New York. It was by no means was this my dream. Um, the I mean, I was much more headed for. I thought I was headed for going back to the land and
Mm.
moving up to the woods in Mendocino County or maybe Vermont or something. And but I began visiting New York this was actually through folks that people like Carol Freeman, Carol Silverman, Lauren Brody, ultimately that I met either at or through the first Balkan Music and Dance Camp in 1977. Um, so I began visiting New York, and then what came up in the later '78 was the opportunity of a job in New York. So I had a partner in New York, Lauren Brody, at the time, and the opportunity of a job through the American Jewish Congress, funded by the CETA Artist Project, the CETA Comprehensive Education and Training Act,
Mm.
which was a Carter administration initiative that had a CETA arts aspect, but a lot of it was about employing people to build
Mm.
roads and that kind of physical infrastructure in the U.S., a sort of much smaller New Deal idea. And
Wow.
I want to mention that in particular, given
Yeah.
it talks about building infrastructure in the states and creating the Green New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. So through the CETA Artist Project, the American Jewish Congress hired quite a few of us, mostly classical musicians, but with the first stage of the project, um, having a focus on klezmer, Yiddish folk music, and so forth that
Mm.
involved Andy Statman, Henry Sapoznik, Miles Krasson, some people might know from the time. Um,
Mm.
and so the combination of having a partner in New York, and the opportunity of that job, which I auditioned for and got, to perform and disseminate Jewish music in New York City, was what brought me to New York initially. And I mean, I really didn't want to move to New York, but people said try it for a year, and I did, and I stayed for 35. So, and not because I, was totally in love with New York. I mean, it took me 19 years before I ever said, I love this place.
Hmm.
And still I want to leave. But
The
because
sleet and snow and rain never didn't quite do it for you.
no, it wasn't that. It was the absence of the natural world and the easy access to nature that, say, California or even lots of other places outside
Sure.
the metropolitan area has. Because LA, even LA, this huge city, has wildness all around it and through it.
Um, Episalid.
Yeah. Um, I should sing. I wrote a song about my dad that actually I began 40 years ago, 2 weeks after my father's death.
Wow.
And it just kind of came to me one night, and I wrote a couple verses, and I thought, I can't sum up my father in a song, and this is too simplistic, and so forth. So I put it aside, and I didn't touch it for 38 years until a friend of
Wow.
mine heard my early kind of practice recordings of it and said, I really love this. This is, what is this? And I said what it is. And then I thought, maybe I should see if I could finish it or do something with it. So then about not quite 2 years ago, I wrote the rest of it. And then, I mean, I've still been kind of tweaking it a little bit. But so you'll hear it's mostly in English. It's partly in Yiddish. And it tells very much a lot of this story because it's really set. Its images come from, and its feeling comes from, both connects to where my dad and my family came from in Eastern Europe. It connects very much to the time we spent, especially out in the natural world together in California and New England, in particular, in a place that my family had on an island in a lake, which sounds very posh, but I should say this was an island that my dad and my uncle bought in 1937 for $275.
Wow.
And where my family really like recreated Lithuania up there. So, and then it has very much echoes of where I live in Scotland now, with the sea and birds and animals and fields right outside. And we live really right between. We live 200 meters from the sea and about that same distance from where the fields start. So lots of sheep and stuff. So, and herons. My father was an immigrant from far across the sea. He came from so far away to end his journey here at the edge of a field by a line of maple trees, glowing red and yellow in the autumn of the year. Born in an empire on the very edge of time, in a small town in the forest, he came into this world. Wheels of war were turning, fires of change were burning. He sailed away into a distant land. Ah, na, 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 na. Avu gehen Iden, noch ein lang Weg dem Mieden. Wir hatten Kama und dem Unsee seinen Schenito. Die Zeit lebt wie ein Hoser weg in tiefen Wald rein. In Schkie oben auf die Felder, dunklen die Kumbelo. Hoi nimm dir mit dein Hack und Säg, dein Tatschkale voll Klugerät. Nimm dir mit die Stiefel, die Kojene, die Zwei. Ich komm dir schön ankegen, nur ich geh dir noch nicht noch auf dein weißen Weg, dem stillinken wie Schnee. Na 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 in the murmur of the maple, in the sighing of the pines, in the wail of the midnight loon when the glowing moon hangs low, in the ripple of the silent fish that stir the depths below. Your fire is in me everywhere I go. When the ice is out in April, you pull the boat up in the cove. Hear the thunder quake on the summer lake in the August sunset glow. And when December's icy hand lays bare the wooded grove, your tracks are in the deep and driven snow. Ой, ты же едешь, дальше будешь, так как льется, так и пьется. С кем наберешься, того и наберешься. Ой, ты же едешь, дальше будешь, да как льется, так и пьется. Старость не радость, сегодня надо выпить. Bin's mir finster in die Egen, bin's mir lichtig in Gedank. Bloß ein Mensch hast du gewesen, doch war Menschheit dir gestellt. Kann sich schön auf mir verlassen, zu deinem Meile sein Gitterei und mit Ehrlichkeit sich führen auf der Welt. Now for all the roads we traveled and the ones we didn't go, for all the tears these many years, this twilight song I sing, and when the fog of autumn drifts upon the rocks below, my heart is like a heron on the wing. Na 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 na.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, you're in a unique position to get that, I think.
I'm crying here. I feel like I don't know where I was just transported. Maybe I was, I guess, transported to where you are a little bit, but like in a small stiebel. And I feel like, you know, because often people say to me like about the dissonances that I carry, but I don't also experience them in that same way. And then I look to people like you as role models, and you live it in such an, um, you know, integrated, natural way.
Wasn't always true, but um,
Hi, Ingo.
yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I kind of want to go two places here. Hello there, wer das?
das ist Hillel Yossel, Sie skinned.
Oh yeah, Hillel Yossel. Good morning, dear Hillel Yossel.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, take.
yeah, one is the integration. No, one question is like, what are some of your dissonances? I mean, I can imagine having known you since pretty much the very beginning. Is this a time to talk about what you feel those dissonances are?
No way. I want to hear you sing and play. I mean, I feel like, I mean, you've named them. You've named them from, Frum and Freiwelter to Bundistische to Zionistische, roots. Um, but, but, when I sing, they're all, they coexist.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, of course, I know those that you're talking about. I was slipped my mind for a second, but by the way, if it looks
Yeah.
like I'm not looking at the camera, which I'm not, it's because I have your images on my computer and the camera's at a different level. Um,
Mm.
if we were just talking, I would be more
No,
integrated, so to speak.
um,
Yeah,
so can we count how many instruments or languages you know?
the instruments is easier. Besides my voice, really, I play guitar, violin to one extent or another, and some accordion. I never learned piano. I just taught myself accordion
Mm.
to the extent that I play it, and do some percussion and that sort of stuff. But instrumentally, that's it. Language wise, I know parts of 21 languages. They're I, with some sort of ease. I could, different degrees of fluency. I could, get along in eight, and I mean Yiddish is of course, one of the first, but so Yiddish, Russian, Polish, English, uh, German, the former Serbo-Croatian because I lived in Yugoslavia, Spanish, very much from California, and but then New York, where I spoke lots of Spanish and still do from time to time, and kind of Dutch too. I mean, I get rusty in one thing, but I read lots of languages and I
Mm.
can go places and communicate with people, and that's it.
Um, do you feel drawn towards one more than the other, or is there one that captures more Haim for you than the others?
Yiddish captures a lot of pain. Um, you did say pain, yeah?
I said Haim,
Oh, Haim. Okay, that's
but
interesting.
that's a good slip.
Yeah, really, really. And not it's not wasn't a slip. It was just right. Okay,
Yeah,
what I heard. Anyhow, um, they're all in there. I mean, Yiddish, of course, is Hamish. And I mean, it's it has the word for it too. Um, English is natural. I mean, I grew up in the U.S.
right.
It's the language I was educated in. It's my for sure my most fluent and nuanced language. Um, but they're all for different kind of times and places or different shades. I mean, I'm thinking of like they're like ragas in the
Mm.
Indian sense. I mean, different ragas for different times of
Mm.
day,
Mm.
different occasion, different kinds of weather.
Mm. Mm.
Um, there, and I mean, as you well, you're also bilingual too. It's I mean, I think in different kind of combinations of them, and often a word will come to me or a phrase will come to me in one language that not necessarily the one that I'm speaking at the time, but the the ones that are very close are Yiddish, English, Russian, and Polish have a whole. I mean, there's the Hamish part of those, to the extent that like they were Jewish languages to me. I mean, I don't think I ever spoke either of them to anyone who wasn't Jewish
Mm-hmm.
until I was 18 or 20 years old, and I
Mm.
realized, I realized I can't just slip into Yiddish with this person,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa too. I remember meeting that the first time I ever spoke Russian with someone who wasn't Jewish was meeting two Soviet athletes in Yugoslavia who were from out in Siberia, and I was like, whoa, these guys are like, really Russian, it was like, but then those two languages, Russian and Polish especially, and to some extent Ukrainian and a little bit of Belarusian, those are more, especially Russian and Polish, are much more connected with my adult life because I
Mm-hmm.
began to use them from the time I was 20. I first went to Poland in 1974 when I was 20,
Mm.
and then had a lot of after I moved to New York, had kind of in partly like lived. I felt like I partly lived in the Soviet Union. That I was doing a lot of ethnographic field work
Mm.
and developed lots of friendships
Mm.
in the community of Soviet Jews from what was still before it was the former Soviet Union. It
Right.
was still the Soviet Union. So that has a lot of more resonance to me from my adult life too. I lived a lot of my life in German
Mm.
because of the whole klezmer music phenomenon and the interest in things Yiddish and klezmerei, etc. in Germany and Europe. Spent lots and lots of time there between the mid 1980s and the early probably 2006 or so, and still do quite
Mm.
a bit. But I was also, my first wife grew up in East Berlin, so and also German was also a language I kind of learned some very early on in my family because I think I mentioned my mother's family. My grandmother on that side was from the Bukowina, and she used to speak. She spoke to me in this kind of Bukowina Deutsch
Mm-hmm.
a lot, and so
Mm.
that's an important language for me too.
I'm realizing it's showing zwei, and I
Yeah.
want to. Should we? Do you want to maybe? Should we end with a niggin or a song? You want and
Yeah. Um, Not that I can't think of what to do. I'm thinking of which one to do.
mm-hmm.
And we talked about as this kind of mina. There's a song I wrote that I really haven't sung very much, but that's a similar sensibility. My heart is telling me to do as this kind of mina, though. Maybe I'll do both, or a little bit of one, and a little bit of the other.
What does yeah.
Yeah, hang on a second. Just put on the old capo here. Oops. So this was inspired by the first of three brief visits I made to Israel. When it's called Vered das Ayid, who's a Jew, or who's Rabbi Simchis und Ayid bringt der Wein. Ayid wird älter und Ayid schläft ein. Ayid ist größer, Ayid ist klein. Da sagt mir, liebe Menschen, wo sie kann nicht sein. Ayid macht Shabbos, sie fahr sich, sie fahr alle. Ayid macht Mishge und Ayid macht Geld. Ayid macht mit die Seiten, ich bei gute Zeiten. Da macht Shechionus, sie sau, ist gelost die Welt. Ayid, 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 wer ist das Ayid? Ayid, 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 sing sie mit das Lied. Sing sie alle und wird sie kein Mal mit, weil wo mir steht und wo mir geht, in da ein Stückl Lied. Ayid tut Mitzvahs und Ayid tut Zuwe, Ayid tut was man darf tun in Regen und in Kält. Jiden schreiben Knoim, a viele fort mit Goyim. Jiden machen Kinderlach und schaffen gar eine neue Welt. Ayid spielt Fiedel und Ayid spielt auf die Nerven. Ayid spielt im Purim-Spiel und geht verstellt. Ayid spielt in Korten, in so einen dicken Garten. Ayid spielt a Liebe, chotsch ihm ständig etwas fällt. Ayid, 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 wer ist das Ayid? Ayid, 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 sing sie mit das Lied. Sing sie alle und wer sie kein Mal mit, weil wo mir geht und wo mir steht, Ayid, doch Ayid. Maybe I'll just go on. Ayiden seinen schwarz und Iden seinen weiß, Iden seinen gelb und Iden seinen bräun. Jiddische Weiber seinen gute Schreiber, jiddische Kinder seinen Malach Elioin. Iden gehen Peis und gehen Lissivate, aber ihr geht noch Iden mit dem Kopf auf. Jeder lach und Jiddischke, sie kämpfen für Gerechtigkeit, sie kämpfen mit der Schobe und sie kämpfen mit dem Guf. Ayid, 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 oi wer ist das Ayid? Ayid, 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 sing sie mit das Lied. Sing sie alle und wer sie kein Mal mit, weil wo mir geht und wo mir steht, Ayid, doch Ayid. Hey, one more verse. Ayid tracht euch a Weltele und bringt unter am Malchus. Ayid versteht, was der Menschheit fällt. Ayid ist in der Heim, in was kann mir soll nicht sein. Und weil mir treibt von Land zu Land, Ayid dort liebt die ganze Welt. Dort Tomer wird ihr meinen, als ich halt noch von jeder Lach, ist du a guck noch wo ich wohin und wo du Taki bist. Und strebt sich noch a Welt alle, a schöne, a gerechtige, kidei mir Menschen neber soll nicht halten, da siehst. Ayid, 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 oi wer ist das Ayid? Ayid, 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 jeder singt sein Lied. Oder jeder singt sein Lied. Oi sing sie alle und wer sie kein Mal mit. Oi soll die Sonne im Gehen in der Erd, es bleibt der Stickellied. Rock and roll.
Wow. That's is that recorded, Meyshke?
No,
No.
I wrote it. When did I first write it? 1992. Yeah, a few months after coming back from Israel.
Wow.
And it's not only about the state of Israel. I mean, it's not really about that at all. It's but it prompted me to think about a lot of stuff.
Mm.
So, yeah, no, I been wanting to put that out. What I just kind of realized is like, I wish it wasn't so gendered that we have this term Yid,
Mm-hmm.
and it's masculine, and okay, it's a traditional term, but a lot of it I actually can make into Eden,
Yeah.
put in the plural,
Yeah.
but not all of it. So, Azay.
Jose, um, thank you so much for being here and giving of your sight and neshama and hearts with us. And I realize I didn't even ask you about your National Endowment Award for folklore and plenty much else. But thank you. Adank, adank, ahatzken dank. Really and truly.
Dir größten Dank. Erstens, thank you for doing this. I mean, I've told you before. I think this series that you're doing with people. I mean, I was so moved by the your conversations with Moshe in particular. But erstens das, zweitens, it's wonderful because, like I said, you as a person and all the things that you are kind of uniquely positioned to understand these songs, both as a mensch and linguistically and
Hmm.
culturally. So yeah, anyway,
Um,
a big pleasure and a pleasure to pursue our friendship further too.
Amen. Amen. Take good care. Meyshke, dank. Sei gesund.
You too. You too. Zult mir alle sein gesund und
Amen.
stark. Okay.
Peace.
Papa. Papa.